This week on London Real, we have the biomedical gerontologist, Dr. Aubrey de Grey.
Aging is the world's most important problem. Answer is periodic preventative maintenance. We have a 50-50 chance of getting these technologies to a decisive level of comprehensiveness within the next 20 to 25 years. There's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years. We've got to get people more comfortable with submitting to medical treatments when they're not yet sick.
London Real presents Aubrey de Grey, How to Live Forever.
I prefer to be a heretic than a maverick. At least it makes it sound as though you might be right.
And London Real is back in your life. This week on the show, we have a fascinating man by the name of Dr. Aubrey de Grey, and he is a biomedical gerontologist. What is that, Brian? That's a fantastic question. That is a guy who studies the whole concept of aging. And in Aubrey's opinion, aging is really the accumulation of damage to the human body, and it's not something that we should accept as a given or accept as something that's inevitable, and it's something that we can really find a way to prevent. And once you start thinking about aging this way, it really starts changing the whole game. And Aubrey is famous for this concept and talking about it around the world. He's also famous for that beard that he sports, which is really truly magnificent and amazing. He's also got some funding in the past for some very high-profile individuals, including Peter Thiel, who wrote him a check for about $6 million a few years ago. Peter is famous for his creation of PayPal and now Palantir and many other startup companies and investment in Facebook. And so, you know, some real big names that have supported Aubrey over the years in the research that he's doing. And so we sat down and talked about this whole concept as far as aging, you know, being this kind of this damage issue, and how ultimately we really could prevent it and start talking about us living for hundreds and hundreds of years or living forever. And it's something that really fascinates us humans, especially as you get older. You start thinking about, you know, the whole concept of you dying and if this can be prevented. And so it's something that Aubrey wants to take from kind of a research level and take it to a more practical level. And so it's a very interesting discussion. He's a fascinating guy. Reminds me of the consummate British professor and intellectual. He also spends a lot of time out in California, and you would have definitely heard of him before. So I hope you enjoy my talk with Aubrey. Like I said, a really fascinating individual with a great accent and a great thought process on life. I hope it makes you think a bit more about the concept we have of aging and whether we should maybe change our whole mind frame and start thinking of it as not something that we almost go through and then we almost get used to it, but maybe it's a medical problem that we can actually treat. So hopefully that's food for thought, and you know, that gets you excited. I'm cruising through here the mean streets of Shoreditch. You've probably seen this if you've been through East London. I want to give a big shout out to the guys that make us look good online, and those are the folks at Squarespace. This is an all-in-one platform to help you build the best-looking website or online portfolio. We use them, and it really makes us look great. And I always tell people, you know, the web is your first chance to make an impression on people, and so make it look good. I always check people's website to see if they're professional and if they look good. And with Squarespace, you can build something so simple, a blog, a video site, even an audio piece like a podcast. It's just easy. So go to squarespace.com, check it out. You can start without a credit card. Use the code London when you go to buy, and you get 10% off. And it's all good. We got lots of love for those guys there. And on our blog, which is on our Squarespace site, we've just released a new article from Dave Asprey himself, the Bulletproof exec, and this talks about the benefits of intermittent fasting, and it's something he goes more into on his fantastic book, which is The Bulletproof Diet. And to find out more about that, read the article. You can also go to orderbulletproofdietbook.com, where you can get 10% off, I think, your first purchase, and also get the book for chefs, the Bulletproof Chef ebook. So great stuff happening there. More blogs to come from Dave. The last one, I think, was 5 reasons how bulletproof coffee can replace your breakfast. And you know, we drink it every day here at London Real, and I serve it to all my guests. So it's all good having those guys on board. And there you go. I'm going to be signing off here and letting you spend some more time with Aubrey. If you want to support your London Real colors, go to our gear section on our website. We got hoodies, we got coffee cups, shirts, all that good stuff. Thanks for giving me love. If you haven't checked out my TED Talk, please go check it out. Leave it a comment. I'm replying to all of your questions there. So if you have a question for me, put it on the TED Talk YouTube comments, and I will get back to you. And that's it. Thanks for all the love. And now I leave you with Dr. Aubrey de Grey. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Aubrey de Grey, who is a biomedical gerontologist and the Chief Science Officer of SENS Research Foundation, dedicated to combating the aging process. He is the Editor-in-Chief of Rejuvenation Research and holds a BA and PhD from the University of Cambridge. Aubrey, welcome to London Real.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for being here. I kind of want to jump in. One quote of yours comes to mind, and it is, quote, "I am working on the world's most important problem." And I believe you want to raise awareness of the feasibility and importance of bringing aging under real medical control. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. It has intrigued me and indeed frustrated and astonished me for many years that this is something that needs to be explained to people. It seems to me to be completely obvious, and indeed it's been obvious to me ever since I was a young kid, that aging is the world's most important problem, in this very obvious sense that it causes the most suffering. 90% probably of the medical problems in the entire world, certainly in the industrialized world, and it's going up really fast, it's way over 50% in the developing world, are caused by simply having been born a long time ago, the accumulation of damage in the body as a side effect of being alive. And undoubtedly, the overwhelming majority of suffering in the world is caused by ill health. So it's a no-brainer. And yet, people don't think that way. Why not? I would say the only reason, the overwhelming reason why people don't think that way is because it's too scary. It's too miserable to be thinking that way. And the reason it's miserable is also pretty clear, namely that until quite recently, really until I came along, we haven't had the faintest idea what we could ever do about it. If there's some ghastly thing that's going to happen to you and your loved ones in the probably relatively distant future, then you're not going to want to spend your miserably short life being preoccupied by this terrible thing. What you're going to want to do is find some way to put it out of your mind and, get on with it and make the best of what you've got. And it doesn't matter how you put it out of your mind, how irrational your rationalization is. And so I come across the most utterly laughable, tragic arguments that people give for saying aging is actually a good thing or it doesn't matter or whatever. But ultimately, I don't exactly ridicule these people at all. I really sympathize with that kind of thinking. It's just that now it's out of date. It's only become out of date in the past 10 or 15 years since we've got a plan for actually bringing aging under medical control, and that plan has a respectable chance of delivering within the foreseeable future in time for lots and lots of people who are already alive today. But now that is the case, this irrationality is a huge part of the problem. It's undoubtedly slowing things down a lot and costing us a lot of lives.
Right, and as humans, it's fascinating because I was watching your TED Talk and you say it's the most important problem in the world, and I'm like, yes, it is, because I'm watching you and you quote the figures like 100,000 people die every day, from age-related issues, and that's twice as big as the next biggest killer. Mm-hmm. And in the developed world, it's 90% of the cause of death. And so you're like, as humans, I know that we just naturally avoid certain things that we don't like, and subconsciously we make these decisions. And aging and dying from old age is something that is it's one of our greatest fears, isn't it?
One thing I want to actually emphasize really at the outset here is that the death aspect is really not the main thing I want to emphasize in terms of the suffering. Because, death is bad. People, mourn about people who've died. But the fact is, in general, aging causes people to go downhill for a long time. So when you're in a really bad state of health, a lot of people will say, well, death isn't such a bad thing. But of course, that's not the point. The point here is to stop people from going downhill in the first place. So the longevity benefits that we may experience, that we may benefit from as a result of these therapies that I and my colleagues are trying to deliver, are a side effect. They are a side benefit of the health benefits. Since being sick is the main risk factor for dying, it stands to reason that if you can stop people from getting sick, then they're going to live longer on average. And if you can't stop people from getting sick, then they're not going to live longer on average. So nobody has any right to worry about the possibility that we will substantially extend people's ill health, that we will keep people alive for a long time in a state of health that is typical of today's elderly. What we will do is we will have people living longer, but that will be because they're staying healthy longer.
Right. And you talk about it more as physics and less of biology. You were saying that as soon as we're born, we start deteriorating, and you said aging is the accumulation of damage, which is an interesting way of thinking about it, because as humans, we don't see a 10-year-old and a 15 and 20-year-old as having damage, but obviously we see 60, 70, and 80-year-old, depending on the amount of damage that we connotate with aging. Is that really a frame of reference and the way we're thinking of it?
It really is. A lot of people have difficulty with this analogy when I say, listen, the human body is simply a machine. It accumulates damage just like a car or an airplane. But in fact, it's a really good analogy. The difference between the human body or any living organism on the one hand and inanimate objects like cars or airplanes on the other hand is very substantial, but it's only a difference of degree. What we have is, number one, that living organisms are much more complicated and that we don't understand them very well because, of course, we didn't design them. And secondly, number two, that living organisms do have built into them a lot of automatic self-repair machinery that gets rid of most of the damage they do to themselves as it's being created.
Right. So we see these machines that are repairing themselves all the time, and then we don't equate them with real machines.
Right. But these differences are not decisive. The similarities are the decisive thing, because, number one, the complexity is just a matter of degree, obviously. And number two, the fact that we have lots of inbuilt automatic self-repair machinery doesn't take away from the fact that there's some types of damage that the body does to itself for which we do not have repair machinery. And those types of damage accumulate throughout life, just like the various types of damage that a car does to itself as a result of, rust accumulating, being taken out on the road or whatever. So really the analogy is very, very valid. There are other parts of the analogy that are valid. One part is what you mentioned a moment ago about it's not being clear that a 10-year-old or even a 20-year-old has any damage. That's very true. But it's also not apparent that a 1-year-old car has any damage. The thing is that just like simple man-made machines, living organisms are set up to tolerate a certain amount of damage with essentially negligible diminution of function. And it's only after the damage accumulates to a level that exceeds that threshold that we see the function diminishing and going downhill. Okay. And of course, eventually the function ceases entirely, just like a car. Right. So that analogy is really the main thing that led me to the thinking that led to the SENSE research program. I realized that in order to really postpone the ill health of old age in the human body, we needed to look at what we already do that successfully postpones ill health in cars or airplanes. Because the fact is, we're damn good at that. Cars are not built to last more than 10 or 15 years. Maybe some cars, like Land Rovers, might be built to last 50 years. But your typical car isn't. And yet, we've got cars around today that are more than 100 years old. What's going on there? How did that happen? Answer is periodic preventative maintenance. Now, all of us have cars that we do a certain amount of maintenance on, the amount that the law requires, and the cars are set up to last a certain amount of time in the context of that amount of maintenance. But the reason we have vintage cars is because if you do more comprehensive maintenance than the law requires, lo and behold, it works better. And we actually maintain performance just as well as when the car was originally built. So that's the goal for the human body. Of course, then there are subsequent steps, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about going forward with regard to what this actually comes down to in concrete terms, but that's the philosophy.
Okay, and then you start talking about actual regeneration. And when you do that, I'm sure you really get people shocked. Because when people start thinking about regeneration, then they start going to science fiction and they're thinking, oh, this isn't natural. Because as a human, I think we're just, that seems like the most impossible thing to reverse the process of aging.
The word that really sits at the fulcrum of my message in that regard is not exactly regeneration, but rejuvenation. So regenerative medicine is something that people are pretty familiar with these days. That's the word that encompasses things like stem cell therapy and tissue engineering. And people know that this is the future of medicine. This is coming all the time. There are news reports about breakthroughs every week, clinical trials and so on. That's all very wonderful. What we're doing is we're saying, why don't we try to apply regenerative medicine to the problems of aging, the problems of age-related ill health? And the practicality is that if you do simple traditional regenerative medicine, stem cell therapies and such like, to address the ill health of old age, you'll make some difference, but you won't really extend healthy longevity and therefore not total longevity either all that much. The reason you won't is because there are some aspects of aging which do not come into the same kind of classification of types of damage that regenerative medicine has been designed for. So what I've done is I've expanded, if you like, I've expanded the definition of regenerative medicine. I've pointed out that there are a number of other potential therapies that need to exist in order to really comprehensively address the damage of aging. And those are therapies that would not traditionally be classified as regenerative medicine, but in a sense they really should be, because they are also about damage repair, about restoring the molecular and cellular structure and composition of the body, of an organ or a tissue or the whole body, to how it was before the damage occurred in the first place.
Let me ask you some questions you get asked a lot, which are just these knee-jerk kind of reactions as humans before we dive in any deeper. And one of them that I know you've heard of before is, well, what are we going to do with all the people? Mm-hmm. If we all live, well, forever, let's take the extreme circumstances. What do you say when that comes up?
Whenever I'm asked about any of the sociological questions, which some people like to call philosophical, but I don't think they're philosophical at all, they're really just sociological questions about aging, I have three answers. So these are questions that ultimately revolve around the possibility that by solving the number one problem we have today, we will create other problems. So my first answer is specific. I go into the details of what we can actually realistically expect to occur in relation to the creation of this new problem. So let's just do the overpopulation one. There's things that we have to take into account that a lot of people don't. Number one, the fact that fertility rates are going down. Women are just choosing to have fewer children. And this is happening across the world, including the developing world, like Brazil, India, not just China with the one-child policy. It's all over. Number two, women are choosing to have their children a lot later than they were. Well, when I say a lot later, maybe only 5 years later, something like that, but it's going to be a hell of a lot later in due course, because soon we're not going to have menopause. So the women are going to have the choice to have their first kid at the age of 70 or whatever. Right?
It's a fascinating concept, yeah.
But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for overpopulation, we have to take into account that the carrying capacity of the planet is not a fixed quantity. That's what it's all about, remember. There's not a problem having 7 billion people on the planet. The problem is that we have 7 billion people, each of whom is actually, responsible for a certain amount of pollution. If we can get better renewable energy, nuclear fusion, things like that, then we're going to be able to have more people on the planet with less environmental impact. So, again, the prospect of an overpopulation crisis is very overblown in most people's knee-jerk reactions.
Right.
Okay, so hang on. So I give this kind of answer, and of course I've got the same kind of answer to, how we pay the pensions, how we make sure everyone has access, won't dictate to live forever, whatever. But I want to move on to the other two answers, because these are very important, and they are the same answer. It's a generic answer that covers all of these things. The second answer is, hang on, let's look at the scale of the problem. Sure, I don't know for certain that we're not going to have an overpopulation problem. I don't know for certain that we're not going to have dictator living forever and so on. But how bad are those problems? Really, even if they did happen, Are they as bad as the problem we have today of all the suffering that's caused by aging and 100,000 or more people dying every day, 30 World Trade Centers every day? Is it really conceivable that even if we had to engage in seriously draconian reduction of birth rates, that would be worse than the problem we have today? It really doesn't add up. That's the second answer. And the third answer is perhaps even more decisive. You may say, well, I really want kids. I think a lot of people really want kids. I think it might be worse than the problem we have today. After all, we have succeeded in putting that problem out of our minds so well, as I've pointed out. Right? But my answer to that says, hang on, whose decision should it be? Whose choice should it be? We have the choice today of developing these therapies or not developing them. Supposing we chose to say, oh dear, overpopulation, let's not go there, then we would be denying humanity of the future the option of whether to use these therapies or not, because they wouldn't have been developed. That we would be condemning them to having the same kind of premature suffering and death that we have experienced throughout history. Whereas if we do develop the therapies, then we're saying to humanity of the future, here it is, take it or leave it. They have the choice. Seems to me to be absolutely unequivocal that we have a clear and present moral obligation to do that latter thing, to give humanity of the future that option by getting on and developing these therapies as soon as possible.
Can anyone argue against those points? I have a hard time even giving an argument against those points you just made.
Well, I have certainly never heard a cogent argument against those points, but of course, a lot of people don't really care about whether their arguments are cogent. I'm often forced to quote that famous Upton Sinclair aphorism. He said that it's very hard to explain something to somebody, to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on not understanding it.
So you mentioned rejuvenation, not regeneration. How close are we to real rejuvenation, to reversing the process, or to making me at 44 this year live to be 144? How old are you, can I ask?
I'm 51.
51, okay.
Yeah.
Or for you to live to 151, or maybe I'm thinking too small here.
So first of all, let me emphasize, I'm not really saying that rejuvenation and regeneration are in any way incompatible. Rather the opposite. I'm saying that rejuvenation is the application of regeneration to aging. Okay. And it needs to be defined a bit more broadly in terms of the technologies involved than regenerative medicine is traditionally defined. But ultimately, it is simply the same thing, just applied to aging. Okay. All right, so in terms of how soon we might get there. Now, of course, this is pioneering technology. We're a long way from getting there, and any technology that's even a couple of years away, it's a mug's game trying to actually speculate about how far away it really is. And so most of my colleagues will say, well, we just shouldn't be doing this speculation. We shouldn't be getting people's hopes up. I say that that's an irresponsible attitude. I say that even though we must recognize that our predictions are very speculative, they're going to be better than most people's predictions, and therefore we have a responsibility to do this, especially in the case of aging, where there is this knee-jerk tendency to make over-pessimistic predictions, to presume that it's never going to happen. So here's my prediction. I say that we have a 50-50 chance of getting these technologies to a decisive level of comprehensiveness within the next 20 to 25 years. I think that there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years, if we hit new problems that we don't know about yet. And also, I have to absolutely emphasize that the only way we'll get there within 20 or 25 years is if the next 5 or 10 years lead to progress in the laboratory that really constitutes good proof of concept. And that will only happen if the funding situation for this work substantially improves.
Right.
At the moment, it's ridiculously underfunded.
Let me ask you about that. Bill Gates has put his fortune and his life work into curing these ailments around the world. I just heard an interview with him, and he's talking about, malaria and all of these issues that, okay, I get it, they're important. But when I listen to you knock off these figures and these numbers, part of me says, why isn't Bill thinking about aging? And I want to talk about this interesting factor is that the older you get, does this not slightly become more important in your life?
Well, let me deal with the last part of your question first,
okay,
because I've got something to say about that for sure. I do find it extremely frustrating that people tend to get involved in any philanthropic exercise, typically when it has touched them personally. So, Sergey Brin putting huge amounts of money into Parkinson's research only once he discovered that he carries some genetic mutation that predisposes him to getting Parkinson's a bit earlier than the average person. Right. Nancy Reagan being an Alzheimer's advocate only after Ronald Reagan. There's so many cases, right? And, that's all very well. I can understand why it concentrates the mind, but honestly, these are intelligent people. And they would, if you ask them, are you fundamentally humanitarian, they wouldn't say no. Right? So it makes no sense to me, and especially it makes no sense for really pioneering things. Because if you look at the actual mathematics of it, it makes, I think that we've got a 50% chance of getting to these therapies working within 20, 25 years. Now, I think that I myself am making a difference to that number. I certainly do. And that's great. I'm very proud of that, and it's very fulfilling. But how much difference? Even in the most extreme example, I can't really see that I'm making more than about 5 years of difference. So if I look at what that means in terms of my own probability of making the cut, it's maybe 5%. Either it's harder than I think it is, and therefore, however much work I do, I'm not going to make it. Or it's easier than I think it is, and therefore, even if I were doing something completely different, I would make it. So it's only this little grey area in the middle where I'm really affecting my own chances.
Right.
And, it's not very exciting, 5%.
No, it doesn't move the needle, as we say.
But if I think in terms of the humanitarian aspect, the argument is completely different. Because every single day that I bring forward the defeat of aging, and I reckon I'm probably doing that about once a month, I'm saving 100,000 lives. That's fairly easy to get out of bed for. And I don't understand why philanthropists in general don't think that way. It really pisses me off.
Let's take Gates, for example.
So let me actually move on.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Bill Gates. Now, Bill Gates is an example of someone who is not does not have that problem. He's very definitely doing stuff for the disadvantaged, and he would not count as one of the disadvantaged.
Right.
So that's great in that sense. But what he's done is he's decided very explicitly that what he wants to do is to help the disadvantaged. He wants to help people at the tail of the curve. And, that's fine. I don't want in any way for Bill Gates to reduce the amount of money he spends on malaria nets and mosquito nets and malaria vaccinations and so on. That's great. However, at the end of the day, in the long run, unless you also push the leading edge of the curve, everyone suffers. So it's extremely important. It's absolutely vital that some philanthropists, not necessarily all, but some, should be going in and helping the leading edge to move forward as well. And of course, that's what I've benefited from, with Peter Thiel in particular, coming in and putting very substantial amounts of money over several years into what we do.
Okay, so Peter Thiel is a fan and an investor in what you do.
Without Peter, I have no idea where we'd be. I mean, we have, adding it all together, I think we've received something in the region of $6.5 million from Peter since 2006. And for sure, that's been the major source of funding, with the exception of the money that I was able to put in when I inherited a chunk of money a few years ago from my mother.
That's a ringing endorsement. I mean, Peter is regarded, extremely highly in the technology community and the world community. Some recent book out, 0 to 1. I mean, that's a ringing endorsement on top of the funding, for you.
Yes, you're right. And of course, Peter was already a very well thought of kind of guy back in 2006. He was actually doing particularly well back then with his hedge fund as well, which is one of his few only temporary successes, because it went a bit south after that. So, I definitely thought in 2006, 2007 that my advocacy job was more or less done, that correspondingly wealthy people would be lining up, to follow Peter's lead. And it was extremely frustrating that didn't happen. We had one donor come in 2010 at a comparable kind of level, and that's really all. All the other donations we get are at a much lower level. And of course, the sheer number of donors is going up, and so things are improving gradually. But to be honest, it makes no sense to me that so few philanthropists are visionary enough to be following this kind of approach.
What if Bill Gates did a 180 and listened to this and decided to cut you a check for $1 billion tomorrow? What would you do with that, and how would that move the needle, as you're saying, about this research?
I believe that at the moment, if we added a digit to the amount that we're spending each year, so we went up to $50 or $100 million a year rather than the $5 million a year we're spending at the moment, then we could probably accelerate the research by a factor of about 3. So if I got $1 billion tomorrow, spending it over a period of maybe 6 to 10 years, then that's what it would, how it would be spent. And I believe that with high probability, well, not high, but I'm going to say 70% probability, that we could, within 10 years, reach a point that I've defined as robust mouse rejuvenation, which basically says we develop all of the various strands of sense and put them all together in the same mice such that we can take mice that have had nothing done to them at all until middle age and rejuvenate them really well enough that they live 2 years longer than they otherwise would, which is a hell of a lot more for a mouse.
Right.
That, it seems to me, is, even taking it quite conservatively, that is enough to convince the world, specialists, of course, opinion formers, the world, that we are within striking distance, that it's only a matter of time before we can do the corresponding thing for humans. At the moment, we can extend mouse lifespan by at least a year or so, but only by doing things to those mice throughout their lives, ideally even doing it genetically to their ancestors, their parents. We can't take mice. The best we can do if we take mice that are already in middle age is a few months additions to their lifespan. We need to increase that by, I'm going to say, a factor of 5 before we can really show that we've got this thing licked.
And do you think, say if you look forward 50 years from now, I know this is just speculation, but if this treatment was perfected, is this something that you see maybe as humans we would go in every 6 months or every year and have a shot, and that would kind of keep us rejuvenated and regenerated?
This will be a periodic treatment. The actual how periodic, how often the treatment happens, will depend a lot on the details that we can't tell yet. For example, at the beginning, I think it's quite likely that some of this will have to be administered surgically. We'll have to actually go in and give someone a whole new heart or a whole new liver. And you wouldn't want to do that every 6 months. Every 10 years, possibly. Ideally, though, and I think very rapidly after we get this first generation panel of therapies, we will get to a position where everything can be done much less invasively, by injections and even by oral administration. Today, we obviously have very early stage stem cell therapies and gene therapies, and those are administered by injections. And we're going to need a lot of stem cell therapies and a lot of gene therapies when we develop sense properly. There's no reason at all why those should not also be delivered by injections rather than by any kind of surgery. Things can, in principle, move on to straightforward oral administration. And of course, the less invasive a therapy is, an intervention is, the more frequently it can be administered, and therefore the more thoroughly it can have its effects.
Let's talk about money. You had a couple graphs at one of your talks at Google, and it was showing kind of the amount that we've spent on medical care, and I think maybe even the length of the life that it increased. And then you did kind of a division, and it was the percentage of GDP that we spent on healthcare, and I believe it's gone something like 5% up to 18%, which is just astounding that we spend that much of our money on healthcare. And I know a lot of that is a lot of times in the last 6 months, of the life of a human. What do those numbers tell you on the surface? Yeah,
you've got those numbers right. That's US statistics from the period, if I remember rightly, from 1960 through to about 2010. 5% of GDP going up to 18%. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Wow.
And it's going to carry on going up for the next while. The reason it's getting so high is the things that used to be easy to cure are so easy to cure that people aren't dying of them. And so people are living long enough that they're getting to suffer the things that we can't cure. Those things are the chronic, progressive diseases of old age that are increasingly expensive to, if you like, manage rather than cure, And that's what people have got these days. We just don't have ways to cure them.
What are some of those, just so people have a reference?
So we're talking about Alzheimer's disease. We're talking about heart disease, or most cancers, or type 2 diabetes, or osteoporosis. All of the things that young adults basically never get, but that become exponentially more frequent, more prevalent in old age.
Right. And those are the ones, those are kind of fascinating, because we think of those as old age diseases or diseases, but we shouldn't be thinking of them that way, right? We should be thinking of those as accumulation.
The real problem is the definition of the word disease. When we use the word disease, we put into people's mind the concept of cure, the concept of medicine that can eliminate the disease from the body. Because that's what it is when we talk about diseases that are exogenous, that come from infectious agents.
Right, smallpox, for example.
For example.
Okay.
But when a disease is a disease of old age, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why it doesn't affect people in early adulthood. The reason is simply that it's a consequence of the lifelong accumulation of progressive change in the molecular and cellular structure and composition of the body. Those changes are what I call damage. Those changes are called damage simply because eventually they're bad for you. They cause diminution of function. For a long time, they don't cause detectable diminution of function simply because the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage, of those changes. But eventually, when there's too much change, the function goes down. That's what we call disease. We call it disease simply because it's bad for you. It causes you not to work very well. But in terms of its medical significance, using the word disease, using the same word we use for infections, is actually very misleading and causes the mistakes that we're making in terms of medical research and medical care today.
Yeah, how important is language? You mentioned that word disease. It gets thrown around when it comes to alcoholism and a lot of other things that gets thrown around. I mean, how important is language? Because on this show, we've talked about medicine versus drugs. I mean, that's a distinct language issue that polarizes people constantly, and whether they call it this or that, they can make completely different decisions about life. I'm sure you come upon this all the time.
I think it's enormously important to use language carefully. People very, very often do not appreciate how easily they can be misunderstood when they use terminology that they think they understand. They think they know that everyone defines a word the same way. The word disease is a case in point. The word aging itself, of course, is an even bigger case in point. When I hear people, my critics especially, explain what's wrong with what I'm saying, then 90% of the time, I will understand that where they're going wrong is they're using the word aging in an inherently contradictory way. And I have a very straightforward trick. I have a very straightforward bullshit detector. All I do is I ask them if they could please be so kind as to repeat what they just said without using the word aging. That's all I need to do. And they immediately reveal themselves as talking complete bullshit.
What's an example of that?
Aging is not a disease. What the hell is that supposed to mean? What's it supposed to mean? Does it mean aging is inherently not amenable to medical intervention? Does it mean that aging is natural and therefore we shouldn't be trying to fix it? Neither of these things make any sense at all when you put it in terms of ill health. If you say the ill health of old age is not a disease, then you're trying to say the ill health of old age doesn't matter, and that sounds fairly ageist, really. Right. People wouldn't subscribe to that, but they do subscribe to it by default when they use the word aging in such sentences.
Something came to mind where if you grew up your entire life and were told, that the sun revolves around the earth and then the world was flat, and then you have all these thoughts, and then when someone tries to tell you different, you're like, that's insane. And it's almost like we grow up and we see grandpa and grandma and then they disappear, and we are just told that, not even told overtly, but we're conditioned to the fact that aging is something we have to accept, it's something we can't change, and it's just part of life, right?
You're absolutely right. And actually, if I look at most of the people who are in my field, and the people who really are my colleagues as crusaders against aging, most of them, if you ask them how they got that way, they will tell a story of some kind of epiphany. They will say that there was this particular moment in their lives when suddenly they began to realize that what they had been told, what they had always thought about aging, didn't quite add up, and they started to think it through, and they realized, hang on, this makes no sense. And they realized that aging was actually a perfectly straightforward medical problem that needs to be fixed and could be fixed. Now, a few of us, including myself, didn't have that. I actually never had this misconception. I can't reconstruct how I got that way, but the fact is, ever since I was a very young kid, for sure, I always understood, it was completely obvious, that aging was, number one, a medical problem, number two, it was bad for you and it was a bad thing, and number three, it was potentially amenable to medical intervention, even though it was clearly a very difficult problem. So the epiphany that I had was a different type of epiphany. When I was in my late 20s, and I married first and then met a few other biologists, I started to realize that actually they were all mad. They, not just they, but of course people in general, just didn't think about aging in the way that was obviously true. It was like they all thought the sky was purple. You know, they just had this bizarre misconception. It took me a couple of years, really, to get my head around it, to come to terms with it. But eventually, when I did, it was a no-brainer that I needed to switch fields. I was already working on what I believed was the second most important humanitarian problem in the world, namely the fact that we have to spend so much of our time doing tedious stuff, like going down mines and, serving hamburgers and so on, because we don't have machines to do these things for us. And of course, the increase in automation, in relieving us of these things, has been going on for more than 100 years, ever since the Industrial Revolution got going, or arguably earlier than that, and it's still going. And I was working in that cause. I was working on artificial intelligence research. But it was always completely clear to me that that was only the second most important problem of humanity, and the first most important problem was the fact that we get sick and die when we get old. So when I found out that, contrary to my prior belief, biologists in general thought that aging was actually rather uninteresting and rather unimportant, I immediately felt, well, I've got to switch fields. And luckily, I was in a position where I was able to do that very quickly.
Right. And so your prime objective is to really put awareness on this and say, we need to really put even a small percentage of our efforts towards recognizing this is an issue. It's something that we don't have to accept, and we need to really pay attention to this. I mean, I
guess I would say that my prime objective is simply the result. I want these therapies to be developed as soon as possible. So in a sense, awareness is a means to an end. If I had $1 billion already, I had all the money I needed to get all the research done that I felt was critical path, then I'd probably do not nearly so many interviews and not nearly so many talks, because I'd be focusing on spending that money as optimally as possible. But the fact is, today, that money is not forthcoming, which means that the two things are very linked. The awareness, the outreach, the raising of people's understanding of the quality of debate on all of this is a route to bringing money in the door and getting the work done.
Are we, in a sense, doing our own rejuvenation? If you look at the lifespans or the behaviors of humans in the last 50, 100 years, I mean, the fact that we're eating differently to prevent diabetes, and we're, doing this for heart disease and doing this to try to keep our bodies from aging at the same rate, is that?
We are certainly getting better at looking after our bodies. And it's generally agreed that that's the main reason why life expectancy, why people's average age at death has gone up over the past 50 or 60 or 70 years. In the century or so prior to World War II, we mainly benefited in terms of average lifespan from a completely different phenomenon, namely the control of infectious disease, which in the Victorian era used to take out more than 1/3 of all babies before they even reach the age of 1, and of course a lot of mothers in childbirth and so on.
Right.
That was pretty much a historical problem by World War II. It was pretty much over. So we were not going to be able to gain any additional increase in longevity by bearing down even better on that. But what we have achieved is bearing down on the mortality rates, the risk of death in older ages. And most of that improvement has not been just because we've got more and more sophisticated medicine, but rather lifelong effects, what are often called cohort effects. Things like people's parents being a bit more prosperous and being able to give their kids better prenatal and early life nutrition. Also, of course, smoking becoming less prevalent, obesity becoming